that often when you think about problems like climate change or activists or people engaged in climate change governance get easily frustrated because there is so little progress and there's so little action to tackle climate change. So there are not a few activists or a few policymakers actually saying democracy doesn't work for climate change, and we need more autocratic system. We need more authoritarian governments to implement climate change measures. And there is the other camp saying, wait a second, we shouldn't let go our democratic values and our democratic system in the name of climate politics. And you can think about yourself, how you would position yourself. So either say, okay, we need to tackle climate change democratically, within democratic rules, within democratic systems, or we need an authoritarian leader to implement strong climate mitigation measures. So what I mean with democratic climate governance is a type of action that involves all stakeholders, embraces participation, includes people when thinking about how to tackle climate change. And it starts actually from social movements and protests you can think about. So where do you articulate your your criticism towards the government? And here we see in the early 1970s protest movements in Germany against a nuclear power plant that the regional government planned to build. And it was it gathered so much attention, and also a lot of groups opposing the nuclear power plant, that finally the government decided not to build it. And this is kind of a democratic value, so to say, so to be able to go to the street and prevent a certain political action. Another example, I think, next slide, please. Okay, whoops. This video doesn't work. And here's just one from a couple of months before the pandemic, youth strikes as around the world, also in Jakarta, that particularly young people went on the street and demanded more action against climate change. And the third example is here so-called climate juries. So bodies that are, and this is kind of innovative in a way that one way to solve the climate crisis is, okay, the government tells you what to do. Another way is to ask you what you think is appropriate in your local community or in the sector you work. So climate juries are a way to put together a bunch of randomly selected people that represent a community. So it's like a jury. So this is why it's called climate jury. And they discuss with experts, they discuss with professional mediators in a process to come up with recommendations. So they recommend to their city council, and in this particular case, it's the city of Leeds, where the climate change commissioner was kind of advised by this randomly selected people. So it's not their job, but they have another job, to think about, well, how can we actually do something against climate change in our community? And they come up with recommendations. And of course, then the question is how the government follows up on this and how strict these recommendations can be. But this is one way to engage with the people. So this is kind of a very democratic understanding of how to tackle climate change. So, and there's, we'll talk about this in a second. And then there's the opposite. And there's eco-authoritarianism. And I have it in the slide before that. Okay. And eco-authoritarianism is, that has been kind of came up in the early 2000s when environmental problems became so big, so huge that they're becoming more and more harder and harder to tackle. And it advocates authoritarian measures to tackle issues like climate change. And so through autocratic rule, through strict rule enforcement, no matter what happens, and very anti-democratic action. And what I mean with that is, well, it's not only China, but China is, I think, a very good example for how to do this. If you think about who lived in this area before, or who is affected by certain large-scale activities. So think about people's displacement that are not part of the project development phase. So eco-authoritarianism basically says, well, climate change is above everything, or whatever environmental harm you think about, and people need to accept it. Full stop. Another very dark side of eco-authoritarianism is eco-fascism. And this is something I don't really like to talk about, but I think it's very important to keep this in mind, because what we see here, and this is the buffalo shooter from the US, is that more and more also right-wing extremists use ecological or environmental arguments for their positions. So they link it to racism, they link it to white supremacy, and a lot of these issues to, well, legitimize action against these group of people. So they have a random idea of overpopulation is linked to environmental threats, and this is backed up by a racist or, well, right-wing extremist ideology. So this is also one way to govern climate change, but definitely not the one I would go for. I would favor, but it's kind of a threat to, if you think about how to tackle climate change. So I skipped the democratic one because we can also have this discussion here. But what do you think are advantages and disadvantages of an authoritarian style rule? Think about China, for example, when tackling climate change or tackling any environmental issues you have.